today we have Dr Mariane Judd with us. I've known Mariane for quite some time now. We met many years ago back in the US. So I thought we might start with you just giving our listeners a bit of a background up until kind of where you're at right now and your experience with using sound therapy and some of your other tools as well.
Well, hello, Joanne, and it's really good to have this opportunity to actually talk about, what I do, and that includes extra lesson, which is developmental movement, ILS, the auditory retraining, as I label it, the SSP, which is a more recent tool, and I also probably will start to talk about in terms of, because I've become really interested in trauma, then because I've become very interested in trauma, excuse my dogs, then I'll talk about some of the things that I've started to learn about that, because that's going to be healing trauma as the topic of the conference in April 2020.
And we'll talk more about the conference as we progress through it as well. So your background is a psychologist?
Yeah, I'm an educational and developmental psychologist, because I did teach for 10 years. I have a qualification in early childhood education and then went back to psychology, and at the same time got involved with extra lesson. So I really feel like that insight into early development by being a preschool teacher for 10 years helped me understand how that underlying development actually is the basis of later learning. And then extra lesson actually is based on a Steiner background, and the underlying paradigm is that the first 7 years are actually the basis of the development of skill and to help the child develop the faculty to learn. And its main emphasis is looking at the development of body geography and spatial awareness. So to begin with, we need to develop a sense of like our own bodies. So you see a little baby slowly exploring more and more of their world from just that, they're laid on the floor, they're horizontal, and then they start to reach out, then they start to, at the same time as they're exploring around them from the horizontal, they start to find their hands, their feet, other parts of their body, and then they go through that development of from lying to rolling to sitting to crawling to walking, and then walking, running, hopping, skipping and climbing trees and being very skilled in their movement. But it's the first 7 years that is really the basis of that development. And at the same time, they develop a parallel consciousness. So a baby isn't just, you can see their thinking gets activated as they're learning where's my body, where am I? And it's a parallel process. One thing goes with another, and there's a parallel development in their consciousness. So by 3, the little baby might turn around and they can start to say, I. It's a developmental thing in consciousness to suddenly realise that they're separate in the world. And then you've got the development of language, but movement should come and then language, because we have to learn to use our facial muscles, and our little inner ear muscles have to learn to work for us to be able to take on language. Once we've got language, then we've got thinking. We can put language together to express our thoughts.
So part of extra lesson in the philosophy, because it was developed through the Steiner, and that understanding of development, is the sensory systems kind of part of that as well?
Yeah, well, the sensory system is paramount in that, because it's through the sensory system, like touch, movement, balance. So all of those things interact, because we need touch and movement to help us, and our visual system, our auditory system, all of those sensory systems get integrated to give us a sense of where is my body, where does it end, where's the other person body, where's the table, where's the chair, where's this thing I'm touching. So you develop a sense of body geography, spatial awareness to be able to negotiate the three-dimensional world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's really important that children have an opportunity in those early years to develop that sense of their own body, where they are in space, and then how they can use their body and develop skills. So and then all the other things. It feels like, to me, child development is like a fabric, but you've got to have the basic part laid down so that you can weave the different parts of child development into that fabric. So they have to be healthy also.
Mm-hmm.
If you're unwell, you're going to not be able to engage in that. You're going to not be active enough to develop that movement, body geography, spatial awareness. Mm-hmm. And then it will affect your auditory system.
Mm-hmm.
And your auditory system actually helps you know what's behind. Because if we didn't have an auditory system, we wouldn't know what is behind us.
Mm-hmm.
And then the eyes are linked to the auditory. So there's a sound back there. Oh. And then that pulls the movement. The head makes then the body moves through some of the primitive reflexes. And this is all so integrated that if you pull out one thread, it isn't quite how the fabric is woven, not just how little individual threads are put together. So a child needs to be healthy, have the opportunity to move, have engagement with a caregiver, because that brings the enthusiasm to want to explore their environment, to want to engage. So it's so multifaceted that it isn't just, and the longer I work, the more intricate I see that it really is.
Mm-hmm. So with an extra lesson sort of background, were you working in a Steiner school? Is that how you kind of got in?
I did work in a Steiner, yeah.
In a Steiner. And so now the extra lesson is like a curriculum, and the kids work. Do you set up do an assessment and set up in a program, and kids work through a set curriculum? Is that kind of how it works? Or?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a curriculum. I'd say it's more a developmental approach.
Mm-hmm.
So a child is assessed, and part of that assessment is looking at their fine motor, their gross motor, to see whether they still have retained reflexes, have they established postural reflexes. I look at their drawings, which was part of my research for my PhD, and all the components of the assessment. And some children might have a literacy and numeracy assessment. Some children, that isn't what their issue is. So we do the assessment, and then from the assessment, and also I actually check their auditory system. I check their auditory processing, because that has become like a really, really important part of everything that I do. Mm-hmm. And so from the assessment, it becomes clear what areas the child needs addressed. And then they'll have an individual program, but because movement is fairly generic, we individualise it by going through at the pace that they need and with the type of encouragement to get them to keep on persevering. So the artistry is in how that's delivered. So a lot of that polyvagal theory is really important, like the prosody of voice and engagement. How do you engage the child? How do you get this child to go from feeling hopeless to thinking that they can trust this adult to get them to go back through all these exercises that get them down, moving on the floor, doing things that they wouldn't normally have to do. And so often extra lesson looks a bit like OT. And so all those parts. And then we go back and we reassess probably every 20 weeks, just see where are they up to. But typically a child will take a year to go through that developmental program to 18 months. Some children with more difficulty will take longer, but it's at their pace and not at the pace of a group.
Right.
And that's where we do it as it's an individual program, although we might have children working in parallel. They're doing what they need to do, and depending on the child's needs as to how much social engagement with just the one practitioner or whether they can have some time with another child. It's really individual.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's
that's the
like
beauty.
Following like from what I'm hearing, it's like a neurodevelopmental sort of approach, based on how normal development in all those, the motor and the sensory system happens, and then you're helping to kind of repattern that back into the nervous systems. Is that right?
That's what happens. Mm-hmm. And then using the sound therapy, it's a bit like you've got another area where you're actually waking up the neurology. And I really see it wakes it up to be more receptive.
Mm-hmm.
And it also wakes them up. What we find is after like 6 weeks, the parent will say, oh, they're engaging more, they're happier. And I think the happiness is brought through the sound therapy.
Mm-hmm.
They're experiencing something that is, the brain thinks it's beautiful. It's rhythmical, it's predictable. They're having an experience that's structured and non-chaotic. But the music is something that they experience beauty in their auditory system, where most of the auditory environment that most children are in is pretty downgraded.
Mm-hmm.
The noise from the television, the noise in a home with all the different gadgets. They listen to a lot of meaningless sound. And so their auditory system isn't overjoyed to listen because it doesn't very often get something.
Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of
then they
background noise.
Might like loud music, they might like really clunky music, because at least their brain feels like, well, I'm getting something. And I have no problem with any age group with the classical music. Mm-hmm. We just have to get them through the first couple of weeks of listening, and then all the adolescents, all the little children will put on those headphones. Mm-hmm. And the little children, because they're so open, they will ask. I've had a little 2-year-old that was doing the sound at home when the bigger kids were seeing me, and she would just say, music, music, because she wanted the music every day.
Oh, lovely.
So, it all fits together.
Mm-hmm. So how about you give us, because you've been involved in sound therapy for quite some time, so how about you just give the listeners a bit of a background about that you were one of the first people to actually bring Dr. Minson and Kate out to Australia and give the first training about integrate. Well, actually, I think it was before the focus system, wasn't it? It was the dynamic.
Yeah. Well, we had already trained. There were several of us. An osteopath, Maxwell Fraval, and then Harry Armitage joined us, and we all trucked off to America and trained with Dr. Ron Minson, in his initial sound therapy program. And so we used that. And then once Randall and Kate got involved and developed the ILS with the invention of the iPod, that to me was like the greatest moment, because suddenly there was this freedom to do the sound therapy because the child could actually wear it and move at the same time. Mm-hmm. So that just powered up my whole therapy. They didn't have to do that as the separate, sound therapy wasn't separate to the extra lesson, the two were then put together. And so we brought them out to Australia because once you know something really works, you want to share it. So we brought Kate and Ron out, and they ran the first ILS training in Canberra. And at that stage, they did the training in the pro, and then when the focus came on board, we were training people to use the focus. So we brought them several times until they basically said, well, come on, you know enough, like you've had enough, you've got to do it yourself. So then we just got up and we took on the training. And then I met you in America, and then I can still remember, like, it was like meeting a best friend. We'd have lunch together, and then when you turned up, it was just like a no-brainer. We could really see an OT was needed in this field because it is so easy to apply it to occupational therapy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas my background is psychology and extra lesson, it's really applicable to that, but psychologists don't so easily see the connection. And so then it was really good to then have you and John become involved, and for it to have more of an easier way to go into the world of occupational therapy and that type of training. And yeah, so it's all been an exciting journey.
And then in that journey, because part of it is that you're really being very honoured to follow through with the pro program, which not as many practitioners follow through with the advanced pro training and the more individualised designing of a program, where I know that that's really stayed true with your practice that you offered there in Canberra. And so go on.
To talk about that, like, I think the pro is the, maybe I'll call it the Maserati. The pro to me, I tell parents, if you have your child come and do sound therapy for 10 weeks and we do it 3 times a week, you will get a substantial shift, and I can actually then show that in the shift in their air and bone conduction. You can actually normalise a child's auditory perception in a 10-week period if you do it intensively. And then I say, well, that's the Maserati. And then there's the other option, because a Maserati costs more than what the Toyota does. So then the other option is that we do a focus. So the parents do the focus at home and the child comes in once a week. And then that just keeps the child going through the developmental extra lesson program. But the parent has to be able to carry out getting the child to listen every day. And what I find, adolescents, I just tell them, you know, with your adolescent, you're going to have to dig deep and work out, because an adolescent, if you can change an adolescent in 10 weeks to be engaging and learning, that is really different to waiting for a year. If a child's just in class 1, well, we could wait a year. And because all that time, their development's moving on, they're becoming more engaged, more interested in learning, their fine motor skills are getting better, so they're doing more writing. All of that can happen because they've got time. But children who have got, either they're older or they've got severe difficulties, they sometimes need things to be more intense, to establish the routine of this is what the child, to get them down doing their exercises on the floor, get them used to wearing the headphones, and then off they go. They can keep going, and we reinforce it by then either getting them to do a bit of consolidation on a focus system, or some children then might just come in once a week to consolidate so that they don't lose any of what they've gained, but they have to keep going with their extra lesson for that year, 18 months.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for people to realise, and I think I'm glad that you're talking about timeframes, that any program that's out there where people are sort of saying this is like a magic bullet, you know, these big changes are going to happen really quickly, that's just not how the nervous system's designed. We certainly have some some programs, which I know we're going to get to the SSP, that definitely open up possibilities and can make some big shifts and changes within a short amount of time. But that's never enough to really take a complex nervous system to where it needs to be successful and functioning and adaptive and stuff. So we really are looking at longer periods of time, and I think having those conversations with parents in the beginning to let we know that we're on the phased therapeutic approach together to get your child's nervous system to be so they're being successful at school and at home and have friends and they feel good about themselves, that isn't an overnight process. And so I'm glad.
And another thing that's really important, you get the changes, but they need time for that to be reinforced and consolidated.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes after 6 months, people say, oh, they're really different. Like, this is what we wanted. But if they withdraw at that stage, the child may lose some of what they've gained because they haven't had the reinforcement for long enough to make sure that that is a consolidated change that won't slip away. Mm-hmm. And I meet some children, Do
you find also that, and I guess that's what I've been learning more about through this process and understanding polyvagal, that it's the other systems around the child that also need to make the changes, to know that this child is now going to behave in a different way, the interactions are going to be different. So that parent who would normally walk in a room and not really acknowledge their child sitting there, is then will now walk into the room and know that I can actually start to have a bit of a conversation. I'm going to get a response, which then again keeps that communication, that language, and that ability for that person to regulate the behaviours as well. So I think part of what helps kids continue to make progress is that all the other systems, the schools, the parents, also need to learn to adapt and change and interact differently as well. Is that what you find as well?
Yeah, I find that. And sometimes there might be dialogues with teachers just to get them to see that the child has changed, and also to talk with parents. So sometimes I feel like we run a little bit of a dual thing. The child's getting the therapy, but the parents are also needing to know how to be different. So occasionally I have actually got parents to come in, like this week, I'll actually talk to you rather than the child. Can you keep the focus system just going at home, do their exercises, but this week we need to talk about like how you're managing with your child, and to be really respectful. And some parents I've actually put on the SSP because I realised that the parent has become habituated to being really stressed when the child, the morning routine, the afternoon routine, the bedtime routine. So sometimes I have to help the parent become de-stressed, and they just take the focus home, not the focus, they take the SSP, and just to get the parent tuned down, and also to stimulate the parent's ability to respond to the child, because you can get parent fatigue. And also some parents, when the child has a focus at home, I get them to say, well, it could be both of you could use it. And then work out, well, where would you start on the focus system? But to be very mindful of where are the parents at to respond to a changing child. And sometimes, if they've got other children, they know what the child could be. And so it's easy for them to see the changes and adjust. But if they haven't got a lot of experience with other children, or it's the eldest child, they really are a little bit worn out by the behaviour.
Mm-hmm. Good idea. So since you brought up the SSP, tell me a little bit about your experience since you've taken that on board? What things have you noticed? Or
well, the SSP,
in?
yeah, and some of that got lost.
Yeah.
So can you just say it again? Because I missed some of it.
So since you've added the SSP to your practice, what have been some things that you've noticed, and then how you blending it in with a program or with your others, or the focus program?
Okay, so sometimes this depends on the age of the child. So I'll start with the very youngest. This is a bit of a scenario I've seen a few times. The child does something like bite another child, stab a child with a pencil. There's an aggressive act that is not accepted either in a preschool setting or maybe they're in kindy. So they're quite young. They come in. This is all, everybody's very heightened around the whole issue. So I do several things. One thing I often say is, well, let's make a 2-week break for the child from that environment to allow everybody in that environment to recover a little bit and get over that behaviour. The next one is we're going to do the SSP. So it could be the 5 days, or they could extend it that they do 1 to 5 and then 3 to 5. So they've got an 8-day thing. And then the other thing I do is I often lend them a weighted blanket if there are sleep problems, and a dream pad, so that if sleep's an issue, then, and often sleep is a problem in children that are having this aggressive behaviour. So they come in, they're doing the SSP, they've got, so a weighted blanket, they've got a dream pad, and then the other thing I get them to do is a total different therapy, is the Wilbarger the TheraPressure, if that seems appropriate for that child, because that's another thing that I've trained with. And it seems to be really something that helps very little children. So I can remember one child, like one parent took off 1 week of work, the other parent took the other week off. And the father at the end of the 2 weeks said, I had this experience in the second week when I was out with my child where I suddenly realised I loved my child. And so it's very intensive for the parents, because every 2 hours they have to do the TheraPressure. They've got to get the SSP done every day. But it's this little combination through working through the sense of touch, through the auditory system with the SSP, and then into the social engagement system also through the SSP, and then to get them to sleep right. You can just get this child in a state where when they go back to school after 2 weeks, everybody is just so surprised. In comes a calm child. And so suddenly you have all that threat that's felt by in the school environment of, oh goodness, it's like, oh, and then the child gets the teachers smiling back, and so you get that reciprocity and you get a child that changes. And then depending on the age, where they go from there.
Yeah, obviously with a bigger platform and a bigger opportunity. And if you've got parents and like in your dad sharing something like, I realise now I really love my child.
Yeah.
It's a massive shift. And recently I was, another great resource that I'd love to share with is the book Grounded by Claire Wilson. And she talks a lot about neuroception. And you imagine that dad, if he wasn't necessarily feeling the love, what was his autonomic nervous system messages that was he sending to the child? Yeah.
So then to get back to then the next group, say that middle primary school, then one of the common presenting problems is anxiety. So sometimes I'll use the SSP as a pre-entry point to coming into doing other therapies, and even as a pre-entry point before we do a lot of other assessment, to get the child into a calmer state. And that if they're doing it at home, often then the advice can be, well, maybe, the child does it and the main caregiver does it, because the child might be more engaged if they see the adults doing this. And at times I've actually rented two so that I could more easily do that. So that's another way to do it. And sometimes I do that when I think the parent hasn't got the coping ability to get to do it at home. Then we just thread the SSPs into the day when we can have a quiet space. So they do it in clinic, gives the child an opportunity to have, the interaction with somebody that's actually a little bit more informed about the process, to help them become a little bit more calm and ready to engage. And
I'm just thinking, I might put you on the spot here, I'm not sure, but you gave a great analogy of the, like the pro systems, like the Maserati, and then the Toyota. And how would you, I'm just trying to think in my mind, how would we sort of maybe say how the SSP is? I was kind of thinking of Porsche. It's kind of quick but can go slow, and it's sleek, but then it can be really slowed down as well. So I'm not sure if you have
or one of the new electric cars that we're still learning about a new technology, that we haven't really plumbed the depth of exactly what will this mean. I actually still see it very much as something that we're finding more and more applications for it.
But I think the analogy to an electric car is good, because clean energy, and the SSP is geared to really, not that the focus isn't either, but really trying to, regulate that autonomic nervous system, which is clean, clean energy. So I like that analogy to the new electric cars.
But I found it, and I have to be honest, when the SSP first came out, because I had used the Pro and the Focus for so long, it was like, well, what do I do with this? It's 5 days. And so it really tested my ability to take on something new and to use it, to find out how could I use it. And now that I've learned that, it's like, oh my God, I wouldn't be without this.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think that is a big hurdle for people. And that's somebody who's already been using quite a lot of technologies and background in acoustic therapy. And I know you do neurofeedback as well. So you're not certainly, unfamiliar with using technologies, but where there's practitioners who very much come from a framework of therapeutic use of self. And the idea of adding a technology is like, how do I do it, or how do I blend it? But you're exactly right. Once you just give it a try and you see the possibilities, it's like, and because it just enables so much more movement forward for your clients. And what you said, how could I not do this now? So thanks for saying that.
Yeah, and it's actually answered a question for me in one way, because at one stage I was approached by a group to ask how could I deliver trauma therapies and what did I do? And it was like, but we don't have the funding, that's all too long, we can't do that. And then with the SSP, there's this 5-day program or 8-day program that you could run, and suddenly there's something that you could offer in a field that, everything seemed to be taking too long. And but I think it really makes a big difference. And a lot of children, I do it at least twice a year. It's one of those things that is really vital for the autistic group of children to do on a really regular basis, because their systems, as the term goes on, their systems get more and more heightened. They just get more and more overwhelmed. And so before they enter the next term, to do an SSP in the holidays, then they go back to school, and it just gets them into school and often running, especially at the beginning of a school year, where new teacher, sometimes kids change schools at the beginning of a year, and they get in, they've got more social engagement, they become more accepted in the group before some of that sensory overload starts to impact them again. So I just feel I put all my children that have, whether they've got a diagnosis, but if they've got that vulnerability of anxiety or a few difficulties in the social realm, in January we try to get them through an SSP, and then we'll try to, depending how they go, whether it gets repeated in the next holiday or whether we get to the 6 months and we do it mid-year. But we've just got this ongoing running, and it works. And for some parents, it's a really big thing to, in the holidays, get the child to be coming to therapy at a time when they want to have a rest, to get in there every day. But the bonus is they have a child at home who's more regulated in the rest of the holidays. So, I try to find the benefits to make it. Mm-hmm. And once the parents have experienced it once with the child, they come back and they often ask, like, can we do that again?
Yeah. I think other therapists have shared that as well. And I know you're talking about the holidays, and I think that's definitely the mindset here in Australia, where during the school break, and we have like the 4 semesters, and so there's essentially 2 weeks off in between each. It's definitely more the mindset where families like to kind of, I'm using this time to chill time.
Yeah.
I know when I lived in the US that often the school break was a time to really try and get some intensive therapy done. So I think sometimes it's harder, what I found since moving back to Australia, that getting people to, let's use this vacation time to actually get some good work done.
Yeah.
Where you're less scheduled from school and stuff and work and
yeah. Mm-hmm. And now I've actually started using it for a little while because I've got training in EMDR as well, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which was originally applied to people with post-traumatic stress disorder. But I'm starting to apply it for people, they may have had early childhood trauma or just a trauma in their life, or they're not coping, they've got high anxiety. And I often use the SSP in conjunction with my EMDR. So somebody might come in for counselling. So now this is just my psychology practice. So they come in for counselling. I work through, what's really brought them to a session. And then if I think that there is something that they have experienced as traumatic, then the SSP is sometimes something that they can start that at home, and we start the EMDR at the same time. So it's just helps their system become more regulated at the same time as they're going in to deal with the trauma. So it's a parallel process.
I was going to ask you, have you come across many people who have had some over responsivity from the SSP? Would it be maybe more activated, like some of those counselling cases you mentioned? Have you?
None. Some have found they've got a point to in the middle, and I have to, like, one of my learning curves was I started to do children and parents together and bring the parent in to be with the child in the clinic. And I realised that do this with caution, because sometimes this particular experience was the child had actually been doing sound therapy, and then we would, it's the first holiday period that we could do it. So the child had already had some sort of work and was in a different frame, whereas the parent I hadn't identified as to how over stressed they were. And day 3, I've got a parent crying in the session with the child. And it was like, oh dear, like this was not quite what we needed. So now I've been a little bit more cautious to think that okay. Yeah, now I've become more cautious in putting parents and children together, because I think that, you know, sometimes the parents, I don't know exactly what their history is. So now we've just gone back to just doing the children. And then I see parents, if they need counselling, they come through a counselling stream. And then when the SSP is appropriate, then, and sometimes they come into clinic, like they work it around their work. They come in and we do it in clinic because they want a quiet space and a safe space to do it in. And then that's when I can monitor what's happening and then say, maybe if you're starting to feel a little bit reactive, let's take a day's break. And then, so it was by a misadventure, I actually learned to be a little bit more careful and more considerate in how I applied something.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's why this sort of platform's nice. We get to sort of share that learning experience, because I think, you know, other therapists have definitely found the same, that I think in the beginning the word sort of got out that, yes, try and do child and parents together as co-regulation, and
yes.
which is wonderful. And then we started getting feedback from practitioners, yes, actually we're always meant to make sure that the parent doesn't have a history of trauma, but then also keeping in mind that the parent may not necessarily always recollect that as well. So sometimes we don't always sort of know as well. And I know another practitioner, she shared, and I think this is good as well, is she'll stagger the parent. So maybe the child will start, and then a couple of days later the parent will be doing it.
Okay.
And then they both hit day 3, which tends to be a little bit more work for the nervous system, which can be a bit more fatiguing. They'll both hit it at different times. So then when the child hits it, it's when the mum is still feeling, you know, resourced herself to cope if there's any whiny behaviour or something around about that time. But it's been through this learning experience of practitioners sharing it, that information. Yeah. I just started, I went to my first EMDR training. So I was just so curious about what it is and how it taps into the brain and as well. So I was just curious about that. And I know there's practitioners in the US who are using the SSP as part of that preparation phase before they actually get to do the active work. Have you found that the SSP has helped speed up getting to that active work with the EMDR at all?
Well, it probably has. And sometimes when you put things together, it's actually hard to really know, and because people have different levels of trauma. But it definitely, I actually think it definitely makes it easier for the person to, have trust and to actually go into the process more easily. And then the other adjunct I sometimes use for people with trauma is to also use the neurofeedback, the lens neurofeedback system. And I always see that just is allowing the brain to reorganise itself. And I tell people it's just a way for the brain to let go of an old pattern and establish a new pattern. And it's entirely, that type of neurofeedback is allowing the brain to decide the changes it makes. It's not emphasising a particular brainwave pattern. So I've not got experience across other neurofeedback, but with the lens, that's how I use it as the adjunct. And it actually makes sense to just, and to track people. And then they use, what they do is, I've done SSP, they've done the EMDR, they've got past all of that, and then they quite like to do the neurofeedback as something they just come to do a visit, because it tends to make them feel like the anxiety just evaporates. But it's like layers. One thing by itself, I think, isn't nearly as efficient or as helpful for the client as when you have a combination put together. So you prepare them with the SSP, you do the processing with the EMDR, and then the neurofeedback just allows the brain to reorganize itself and for some things to just complete a process neurologically, and for the brain to be reorganized is the best way I can find to explain it.
And I think you're exactly right, that you need to have a few things in your toolbox. And I found, that often when I was doing more of the neurofeedback when I just had the focus system, when I had my practice in the US, that I would do more bulk of my work with the focus system, and then the neurofeedback was just kind of bringing it all together, helping to make sort of finer connections and having it all kind of, I don't know how to sort of say, just bringing it all together into the networks where it just settled. And kind of was guiding all the changes that the focus system would help put in, and then the feedback would just kind of like packing the sand.
I always say it's like, it's just, then you get time to decorate the cake and just let everything just settle in, and you can enjoy the fruit of the process. And it just, as you said, pack in the sand, or just allow the whole thing to just settle in to a new way of being, like the person feels. I've got one client that's gone through that process that said, I just feel like, how did I not know that I could be this 20 years ago? And because we all just learn to adapt and to be how we are right now. And it's only when some of those levels of distress in our system get like dealt with, or just released, that then we know, like there's this inner joy that can actually be there. And
Mariane, I'm just sort of thinking about your work, and I'm thinking a good portion of it and your whole career has been a lot with children, and then doing some trauma work with some adults. Not many clinicians tackle both because it's like putting one you're either a real, just working with children and or other I'll work with adults. So how do you find shifting from that very, very neurodevelopmental approach, with obviously still using all the sound therapies and the other things you layer in, to a very different kind of approach with trauma?
Because what I actually think that, like, the polyvagal theory is one way to actually encapsulate that, because some of these adults, and some of the adults had come to me because they're the parents of the children I'm seeing. And so a lot of my experience in the last, suddenly there came a need for parents to have more help in the whole child rearing. And so then I just started counselling, and then just realised often where there's difficulty with parenting, sometimes there can be trauma behind that. And it became a spontaneous process until now. I've got a whole lot of people, and now I'm offering services into my local community for the bushfire, for just, people that are starting to realise that they've actually been through something, and now that they're starting to have some things organised in their life, just what they need some counselling. So, you know, things just open up. But I really think that I look at everything often from that polyvagal theory, but also from the Steiner thing, you know, and it's the same with psychology. We've got three parts of it. We think, we feel, and we do. And so Steiner education is like, you start with the small child from up to 7 is learning how to do, how to be active in the world, how to engage with the world. And then the education of the feeling life, and then thinking is something that becomes educated in the adolescence. But when I look at clients, you know, often people that are depressed, they can't get into action. Their feelings are feeling really heavy and their thinking is confused, or anxious. Their thinking's going overactive, and so their feeling is heightened, but again, it disempowers their ability to do anything. Like fear starts to come up. So I can see, like, the polyvagal theory and knowing how the neurological system works makes it so easy to work out where a client is and where they're not functioning. You know, how much in this social engagement, which we should be in, that's where we should be, that's what our neurological system is built for. How much are they in there, or how much are they caught in this feeling life that is overpowering the ability to engage? So with people that have experienced, say, the bushfires, a common thing is like they want to talk about it to try and integrate it into a meaning, but then they start to be a little bit cautious about talking to people who haven't experienced it or weren't there, because it's hard for people from the outside to relate to, well, like, you know, like, can't you get over it, or it'll be okay. Whereas it's not okay, but it can deactivate their ability to do. So it's very hard for them to go out and do all those things they need to organise to be part of the recovery process. And then people that have got long-term trauma, they've managed to somehow encapsulate and put away that trauma, and they've got a way of functioning, but there's a facade. You look in their eyes and there's a little bit of holding back of who they are. The social engagement is a little bit different, and then you realise that then there's a feeling there that is always a little bit cautious in the world and always a little bit protective, a lot of actions around protection. And so the polyvagal theory, to me, just that whole thing where Stephen Porges talked about our physiology is built for social engagement, and if that's not where we are, then we're in some other part of our vagus system, has been really, really helpful and provided, I don't know, a window that I can look at child development, adults that come in for counselling. I look at animals and look at animal behaviour to see, well, with my dogs, like how to work with them, with a grandchild, seeing how does that work in, and how that, whether, you know, you don't want a baby to be in survival mode.
I think you've said it exactly. And I know when I was speaking to Deb Dana, that she was really talking about the fact that, you know, it's a theory that essentially talks about our biology, but then it can be embraced and weaved into whatever kind of practice mode an individual's practitioner is trained in. You know, from somatic experiencing to EMDR, or even just taken into, the education setting, and well, even for us in our day to day, just helps us understand our own sort of behaviours as well, and then helps us enrich even those other practice models that we use. But I 100% agree that I tend to look at, and I think Stephen talks about those, to look beyond diagnoses and really look at what's happening in that underlying regulation system that's impacting that social engagement, and all the other symptoms that we see on the outside stems from that not being where it needs to be.
Yeah, and it's with all the autistic children, it has provided a real understanding as to what some people's actions are, that then to help them understand that action actually puts that child into fight or flight. But some children become immobilized.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got a little graphic example of somebody told me that on the highway there were 4 cars that were stuck, and the person in the first car, their hands were just glued. They were totally immobilized. They didn't know what to do or where to go because there was fire everywhere. The one behind in the next car was just sitting in the car screaming. So it had some mobilisation. So you had total immobilisation. You've got the screaming, so there was some vocalisation. And then there were 2 people behind that that were running around their cars. They were out of their cars and running around. And then somebody came and just had not got so heightened and could just come in and told them all what to do. Get in your cars and come this way. So, and I just thought that was polyvagal theory in that little scenario on the highway.
Mm-hmm.
And the person who still had that level of social engagement, because they hadn't realised exactly what the full impact of what was happening was, they were able to still use their voice and to get all those people moving.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to say, we've obviously touched on the bushfires a little bit today, and for our listeners, I'm sure many people who are listening will know that Australia's pretty much been ravaged by bushfires, and there's been pretty horrendous. And Marion was actually in an area where her house was at risk a number of times, and and in Canberra there's been horrific bushfires around the area, and so there is actually quite a big movement. The government has stepped up to provide more mental health services to people who have been impacted by the bushfires, but it is definitely it's pretty significant here in the country regarding that.
Yeah, because it has gone on for so long.
Mm-hmm.
And some people have had bushfires come back again and again to their area, and it's just it has involved so many people, and at a time of the year when everybody takes it, this is the time in January where everybody just relaxes. You have Christmas, New Year, and it's holiday time, and everybody goes to the beach, and you just let go of the year.
And that's definitely a different mindset from more so here in Australia. I lived in the US for 23 years, and it was pretty much you had Christmas and then you'll be back at work the next day.
Yeah.
And then if you're lucky enough to get the break off in between Christmas and New Year, but pretty much you were back at work, and then yes, you would have you wouldn't always have the day off after New Year's either, but
Yeah.
So it took a bit to get used to coming back to Australia, where it's definitely Christmas and January is wind down time. A lot of businesses closed down, particularly between the Christmas and New Year break, and it is really much on holiday mode. People go to the beach, and where a lot of the areas have been ravaged by the fires were big, tourist destinations where a lot of families would go. Yeah.
And so a lot of people became involved in the bushfires because they either couldn't go away or they got stuck for a period of time. And so a lot of people have actually been impacted by the fires. People have died. Firefighters have died. It's had a really big impact, and billions of animals have died. So we're facing like an event in Australia that has never ever been experienced. There have been communities that have been impacted by bushfires, but never bushfires at the same time all around areas of Australia. So it is something.
I remember as a teenager, I was involved in the Ash Wednesday fires.
Yes.
And I remember we lived up in the country outside Melbourne, and I can still remember going to get my horse. He was in a paddock, and it was a big 10-acre paddock, and the grass was knee-high, and the helicopters are flying just not that far, and flames shooting out. And I'm thinking, I had one little road back out to where we lived, and this is when you didn't have cell phones or anything.
Yes.
And I remember just thinking, am I going to actually make it out or not?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were lucky enough. The wind changed and the fire was about to come across the road, which would have got our house, and then it went the other way. But just that whole being evacuated and the sky having that red glow, and the ash in the air, and that eeriness, that real eeriness. And I can still,
and it goes on for a long time afterwards, because of the smoke in the air. And a lot of the children have come in this week, their first week back at school and back into the clinic, where we've let them do a free painting, and they're painting red suns in the sky. So it's just this thing that they've just seen it for week on week on week, and then it disappears, the smoke goes, and so it's something that I think nearly every practitioner is going to have, some families or children, and it takes there are quite a lot of online webinars for professionals to do to just become a little bit more informed to how to work with people who've been impacted by the fires. And they're really helpful.
So Mariane, since we're talking about trauma, and I'm getting aware of time for us as well, so tell us a bit about the trauma conference, and what spurred you and your team to endeavour to take that on, because I'm sure organising a conference is not like a sit back on a lounge chair experience.
Well, I think it happened, like these things take quite a while to come about. So on a personal level, I started to see children who were in foster care. And so it made me start to think, like, some of their needs were really different to other children. So I started going to more and more workshops about trauma. And then I went to the ILS conference in America where Kim Barthel spoke. And at the same time, Kim Barthel, Stephen Porges were both people informing, my understanding. And she had worked as an occupational therapist, and she's the keynote speaker. She had worked with some severely traumatised children that I was absolutely amazed that she had the resources to actually work with the children and to actually step them through being able to interact again with human beings. It was extraordinary. So I heard her talk several times in America. I went to several conferences that she spoke. And at the same time, went to the Australian Childhood Foundation conference several times in Melbourne, and heard Stephen Porges there. And all of these things started to come together, and we got this idea that maybe if we all became educated as the people that run the extra lesson training course, if we became more informed about trauma, it seemed to be something that was becoming more and more something that children were experiencing. So it felt like we needed to, educate ourselves into how to meet children where they are currently as the world changes. And so then we did that, and then we got the idea that we'd actually run a conference on healing trauma. And so set it up, and then we hadn't found a speaker, but I went to, again, another conference. It was in Sydney where Kim talked, and I got really excited and thought, there's the keynote speaker. So I asked her in the break, do you think you would come to, and Kim, I'd love to come back to Australia. She is this warm, positive, wonderful person. So suddenly we had our keynote speaker. And then because of the whole Indigenous question in Australia, and because we went through the process of the Makarrata recently, where the Indigenous Aboriginal population, or First Nations population, worked to have something to present to the government to try to find a way forward in the relationship. And when that was rejected, it just felt like, it really, really disturbed me. So then I had a parent at the time who was Indigenous with several children. So I just thought, well, you ask somebody. And so she then introduced me to Professor Dennis Foley, who's the other keynote speaker. And he's an Indigenous person, and he's a professor at the University of Canberra. So he's going to do the Welcome to Country and introduce the conference. And then he'll be present in the conference, and then he'll actually give the last lecture in the conference. So as a group of extra lesson practitioners and extra lesson trainers, we just felt like, we've got a responsibility to start to reach out, like, how do we actually start to make connections, relationships, if it can't be done in the bigger world to facilitate that, what can we do as individuals? And then we've got you speaking, Joanne, because you're bringing the SSP, the polyvagal theory, the ILS work, and then because that's been your area of research, so that seemed like a really good way, because that's another way that SSP, other modalities, sound therapy, they all can be used to help people that have experienced trauma, to just re-regulate their nervous system. Then we've got another person who's talking about parenting, and she's a New Zealand speaker who's worked a lot in the Maori population and the general New Zealand population, because as extra lesson, we actually have done a lot of training in New Zealand, and we've got quite a lot of practitioners. And a lot of the New Zealand Steiner schools have embraced the sound therapy, and they've actually got it as part of their, it's just what happens in the school. So it really found ground in there. So because, the New Zealanders are part of our family in the extra lesson family, we thought that because Mary Willow had actually worked so much with parenting, and she came out of more of that Steiner philosophy, because parents also need to know, how do we work with our children? And how, because it's really difficult if a child's been traumatised, or as a parent, if you've been traumatised, to know how to meet your child. And then the other talker is Dr. Bronwyn Haralambous, and she is a lecturer at Sunshine University, running or doing lectures in the Steiner training at Sunshine Coast University. And she's got also a connection with Heartwood, which is an organisation to work with, an initiative to work with not necessarily just trauma, but how to be innovative in the way that we work. And they've actually done quite a lot of work with Indigenous groups to try to build those relationships and understanding. And then on one of the evenings, because we're having evening lectures as well, I'll talk about the extra lesson and how we use extra lesson as a way to also work with trauma and how to be a little bit more trauma informed in the way that you're working with the children. And so there will just be workshops to highlight, you know, how to different practitioners like you, how I work, how Dennis, because Dennis Foley's also worked with lost generation, stolen generation, and with Vietnam vets. So he's had, although his research has been in a totally different area, he's actually had experience in working in community with people who've experienced trauma. And so we tried to, like, it all just came together. So there's Kim Barthel, who is really talking about the neuroscience, and then Dr. Dennis Foley talking about, as an Indigenous person, some of his own experience, and then also how he's worked in community, and then you bringing in the SSP, the ILS, the polyvagal theory, how that can provide an understanding, and then Bronwyn and me as well. And hopefully we've got a really solid part in the middle where Kim has 3 days so that she can go into more depth as to the neurology, but also how do you work from the neurology into therapy.
Nice. Yeah.
And then everybody else will just add other modalities, other understanding to that central core that will be presented by Kim.
Now, because there's Steiner schools all around the world, isn't there? Or are they just mainly? Yes.
So, they're right around the world.
Yes.
So a lot in Europe. It's a big movement in Europe, in America, New Zealand, Australia, South America, India, Japan. Like in China, it's an absolutely, like the number of Steiner kindergartens is just becoming, they're just popping up like mushrooms all over China.
Wow.
So it's a movement, and I think because the education is a little bit gentler for parents that are, you know, first introducing their children to education. But then it's got other aspects that really make it, it's actually an education to educate the child as a human being. So as I said before, to educate their ability to do in the world, their feeling life and their thinking, and to really have that as something that you do developmentally as the child gets to that developmental age, to unfold that next aspect.
So besides the schools then, the extra lesson, the training for practitioners, so that's separate from the schools?
It's separate from the schools.
I just want to clarify, because I'm sure people are probably listening and thinking, okay, I understand what Steiner is, but we're talking about extra lessons. So
extra lesson,
they want to learn more about it, or if they want to do training in it. So talk a little bit about extra lesson, and is extra lesson training also available in other countries for practitioners as well, or?
Yeah, extra lessons available. Well, we're a private organisation, and you can tell by the way that I have spoken that extra lesson in Australia is actually encompassing modalities that are outside, like a Steiner education system. We've really taken on quite strongly through the neurodevelopmental model, looking into the neuroscience, because the two just marry up really well together. And then there's training in America on the East Coast and the West Coast. There's training in several parts of Europe, but maybe not quite as much as Australia and America are probably the basis for extra lesson training. And it's a 3-year postgraduate level, although it's not registered in any way, but we expect that level of capability, that level of being able to think and understand and take on responsibility. So people have to only do it if they have a degree and that they've got some experience working with children. So they've actually got something they can go back and through the training reflect on what they do know to take on new understanding. And then as they integrate the theory and practice, that's why it's over 3 years. Because it takes you 3 years to be able to work with different children, start to understand how do you weave that fabric, how do you address the child's developmental issues. And then we've also taken the extra lesson to Japan and to India. And in January, Lindy Peters and I actually went to South Africa and we started the extra lesson, our style of extra lesson in South Africa, which is another country that has a lot of trauma in its history.
Well, that just sounds, that must sound so exciting to bring it to another country and
it is really exciting because it's a challenge to work out because different cultures have different emphasis. And then how do you bring this other understanding and how do you make it that it meets the people that are going to be using it and the children? Because children in different countries are having very different experiences of the world. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's been really, really, I used to come back on the plane, except for this last time, and think that I was actually lucky to live in Australia because we actually, at the time, it seemed previously, coming back from India, we had less pollution. And then I trained in Japan over the time that the tsunami happened and then the radiation. And, you know, it was a big question as to how was that impacting the children. And you could see it in the assessments that came in, the extra lesson assessments through the children's drawings. You could see that children right across Japan were traumatised by the tsunami.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think sometimes people think about trauma and they think of obviously the main ones of abuse and neglect or violence, and they sometimes downplay natural disasters and the impact. Yeah. And I know New Zealand's having a lot of issues with the children.
From Christchurch.
Yes, yes. And the earthquakes.
Yeah, so many countries I've been to, children are experiencing trauma at a level that they may not have experienced it before. So it became really relevant for us as extra lesson practitioners, and it's also happening in the ILS community. We have to understand how to work with that. And to do that, we have to understand the neurobiology of trauma and how it impacts the development of the neurological system. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have that understanding, then we actually can't quite serve the children and the clients that we're meeting. It's really vital that we become informed and then work out how do we put that into our practice and keep on, like we have to keep on like reading, researching, understanding, reaching out, and then putting that into your working life in day-to-day experience to work out how does the theory work into day-to-day practice, because a theory is one thing, but when you've got a client or a child that's been impacted by trauma, what do you do? And in Japan, one of the things that was really heartening to me was there were several people that were in my training that went into the Fukushima area. And they said the one thing that helped the children was movement. They could get the children into movement, and the child could forget for a really short time what they were living in and through. They could just move and just be children. They could play, they could paint, all those things. They could just be children and be in that realm of childhood where you're just living in this, you know, that realm of childhood where the adults protect you from the outside world. And it was really heartening to think that, you know, it gave them a basis of things that they might be able to use, a repertoire, and then they could extend that into other ways to meet the children's needs.
Sounds like really important work, definitely. So in terms of the conference, is it opened up to people around the world to come to it?
It's open to everybody. It's open to everybody who's interested in understanding children, understanding even like children, adults, adolescents, and the effect of trauma on the neurological system. So it's more, so you don't have to have a Steiner background at all. That's because the idea is that we're all reaching out to each other. Anybody who's interested in, like, how do we make that bridge to maybe deliver services or help Indigenous communities deliver services. And I have to mention when I went to one of the Australian Childhood Foundation conferences, one of the speakers that really, really impressed me was Michael Yellowbird. He was a First Nations person, and he talked about how ritual, like taking many of the First Nations people back into being involved in their rituals, can actually be a stepping stone into working with trauma. And that many of those, and you think, you know, what are rituals like chanting, rhythm, regularity? They're all things that actually calm the nervous system, and they're using voice in a different way. Chanting in many cultures.
It's interesting you say that. I was listening to a podcast by Bruce Perry, and they've developed a neurosequential model. But then he was really talking, and he talked about this even in his book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog.
Oh, yes.
That was just like mind-blowing. But he really talked about a lot of his approach is bringing rhythm and predictability, daily rhythm and predictability about routines and who's going to interact with them and how it's going to happen. So I could see how doing daily rituals, you know, old ones that have meaning, brings in that predictability and what to expect.
Yeah. And so, and the other thing that Michael Yellowbird said that just resonates in my mind, and it's something we haven't actually touched on, he said that the greatest injustice to the First Nations people was the destruction of the biome. So if you actually take away people's access to their food sources and then only give them access to degraded food like flour and sugar, you actually just destroy the gut bacteria. And it was just this tiny little sideline that he said, and I thought, that is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's another area that we're not covering in the conference, but it's another area that we need to look at to understand what's happening with a child's nutrition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm hoping to get a speaker on the podcast who really talk about the whole gut biome and the gut-brain axis, and because as you were talking about, even in the earlier of our talk today, about the fabric and how nutrition and actually what we're putting in the body and how the cells are working are part of that foundation that enable everything else to happen. So no matter what magic therapy wand we may have to wave, if the underlying cellular activity is impaired because of poor gut bacteria and absorption, then nothing's really going to work.
Yeah,
it's another big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and the body's ability to cope with neurotoxins.
Mm-hmm.
So it's another great big topic, but it's another area that, you know, trauma often leads people to forget about their nutrition. So it can actually be something that's really vital for people that have been really highly traumatized, is to just basically for people to provide food. And so in Australia, I heard of one organisation that for people that have got huge difficulties with food sensitivities, they're actually making food and shipping it out to people that no longer, you know, they're relying on what's coming to them, but it will actually impact on their health quite dramatically. So it's just another one of those cases where people are reaching out to other people to provide, because they've got a special need in a different area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think you and I, as always, and we've had talks in the past, we talk forever and ever and go off into many other different tangents and stuff. So we've covered a lot of ground today, and I'm glad you got a chance to really sort of talk about what extra lesson is, because I think it's a really complement to a lot of other therapeutic approaches, and that, you know, and everything we know about neurodevelopment is lays that foundation for later learning and development and emotional regulation and mental health as well. So what we will do is at the end of the podcast and on the YouTube, we'll have links for people who are listening who want to find out more information or even how to register for the upcoming conference that I've been lucky enough to be invited to speak at as well. And we'll also put
if we just let people know, it's in Sydney at the Wesley Centre. So it's right in the CBD.
Mm-hmm. And Sydney, I'm sure everyone knows, is imagine in a beautiful city with our harbour, if you're planning a trip over. But yeah, we'll put those links to that, and we'll put a link to the extra lesson practitioner training course so people want to find out more information about that as well. So Mary, is there anything you think you want parting comments, any advice to practitioners?
I just think to, like as a practitioner, you're on a journey. You're not, I actually used this analogy with a client yesterday, that, you know, we're all learning, and it's really like the big thing is to keep on asking questions, because the questions deepen your understanding, and to just keep on being open to what the needs of the children are, what are the needs of the community that you're involved with. Because if you keep asking the questions, then the answers will come. But you have to, the parallel thing, keep on educating yourself. so that you can take that understanding into your practice. Because, you know, I've had to change where I started and to keep on educating myself and becoming more informed about what my clients' needs are. But in the process, it makes me, I get so much enjoyment out of working with my clients, with the children, with the adults, because by educating myself, I feel like I'm able then to meet more of their needs. And then if I can't answer a need, then I can keep on educating. Mm-hmm. And I'm using what I'm learning to educate the clients to understand their own neurology, to actually answer some of their own questions. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And once they understand their own neurology, they feel like they can actually have more control of what's happening because they understand what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's great advice, yeah, to keep learning, keep enriching, keep filling your mind. And I know for me, for my personal journey, that's, you know, it's almost like you learn one thing and you realise, wow, I've got so much more to learn and add in. And the learning curve has certainly taken me to learning new technologies, because those are what have helped to help my clients reach their goals, because sometimes certain nervous systems need more of a nudge, or they need input in ways that I wasn't able to give with the tools that I had equipped with. And the tools like, you know, different ILS tools, the Pro system, the Focus system, the SSP, neurofeedback, you know, biofeedback with heart variability, you know, they are the powerful tools that really do help create change and help take our clients closer to where they need to be.
Yeah. And to really be open to fully listen to what the children are expressing, either verbally or non-verbally, to really be attuned to, so that you can actually, you know, really respond and provide that sense of safety. I think with children, that sense of safety is so ultimate, because if you can provide a sense of safety, then they can become more organised in their neurological system. And then you can just use other tools. But the first tool you've got is your own heart and the expression of your own heart and your own facial expressions. Mm-hmm. So if you can offer that to the child, you can help a child through a really difficult time. Mm-hmm. Because as an adult, you're there and you've taken care of yourself as well as... so if you've got a need that... And I've just got one of my little therapy assistants said he couldn't wait any longer.
Be on air. Who's this one?
Yeah. What's that?
What's her name?
This is Leo, and I've got two of them because they vicariously came into the practice. You know, I couldn't leave the puppies at home because they'd get traumatised. So I had to. So 10 years later, they're a vital part of the work with the children and with the adults. Mm-hmm. You've got no idea how well a therapy session will go with an adult if they like dogs and they have a dog sitting on top of them. Mm-hmm. You know, people talk about weighted, you know, cushions, or I just use real live, warm little animals.
That's the key of loving affection.
Yeah, and, you know, just that warmth, and then the dog will look at them with absolute adoration, or the person gets upset and the dog leans in. You know, our sense of touch is one of our primary senses. And even as adults, having, and a child particularly, having a dog, and it's really helpful with relationship. You've got to be kind to an animal for the animal to want to be with you.
True.
So it's
well, I really love of my little Labradoodle, Maverick.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. All right, Miss Marianne. I think
okay, Joanne. Well, that was a wonderful adventure in having a lovely conversation.
Yeah.
And I hope everybody that's listening has actually found something that they could resonate with. And I'd really like to see anybody who's really interested in Sydney at the Healing Trauma Conference, because it's actually going to be incredible to have Kim and Dennis both there as our keynote speakers.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll see you then.
I'll see you then.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I hope everyone enjoyed today's podcast. We'll be posting in the show notes as well as on the YouTube closing page how to access information about the extra lesson trauma conference that's being held in Sydney that we spoke about, as well as the contact information if you are wanting more information about the Safe and Sound protocol in Australia and New Zealand. Please contact Integrated Listening Australia. And for the rest of the world, contact Integrated Listening Systems in Denver, Colorado.